Great, I think we're going to get started. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Meredith Malone. I'm a curator here at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum. Tonight's panel, titled Toxic Sublime, Art and the Climate Crisis, was organized in coordination with the installation of the work you see right around the corner here in the Seligman Family Atrium by Madrid-based artist Santiago Sierra, titled 52 Canvases Exposed to Mexico City's Air. So I hope you've all had a chance to see it, but if you haven't, after the panel, please go take a closer look. So with this large scale, here I'll give you a picture of what it looks like around the corner. With this large scale installation, Sierra presents a visualization of the toxicity of contemporary urban life. Sierra is perhaps best known for his provocative performance and installation art that deals with the topic of social inequalities, often replicating capitalist labor relations in art world context to underscore their dehumanizing effects. In 52 Canvases Exposed to Mexico City's Air, he does not reproduce this kind of human-on-human cruelty explored in his earlier works and that he does still explore in other aspects of his practice, but rather here he's employing art as a direct evidence of environmental degradation. Sierra's installation exemplifies, as I'm proposing, the notion of what some scholars have coined in recent years, the toxic sublime, engaging with tensions between beauty and revulsion, abstraction, and the tangible effects of pollution and human-made climate change. Feel free to come and sit down. Sierra made this 52 compositions by placing adhesive lacquered canvases on the floor of a building in Mexico City in 2019 with the windows open, allowing the air to settle on each canvas. Each week for a year, he would then remove one canvas at a time. So there's 52 canvases, one for every week of the year, before having a conservator permanently fix the sediment that had gathered on the surface of each canvas. The artist had them tested, revealing a range of heavy metal particles and bacteria responsible for medical conditions ranging from things like conjunctivitis to various skin disorders. The result is a disturbing time lapse of noxious accumulation, one that refers not only to the pollution in Mexico City, but also to the increasing presence of airborne contaminants in congested and vulnerable areas around the world. Presented in a precise grid, the abstract paintings create a pleasant sort of, I'm calling it an ombre effect, right, from the lighter works up in the top corner to the darker works on the bottom right corner, across our atrium wall here in the museum. Up close, however, you can see on their surfaces are very much covered in a variety of muck, stray hairs, what we think are pigeon feathers, dead insects, among other things, turning the appealing aesthetic of the installation into an abject minimalist grid that is, as the artist has told me, he considers it, he's dirty with reality. The canvases thus simultaneously turn our attention inward toward the vulnerability of our own bodily functions, provoking questions including, as you're standing in there, at least for me, is this what I'm breathing in? Is this what my lungs might look like? But also pointing outward toward the systems of power responsible for these environmental conditions. Essential to Sierra's artwork is an understanding of climate degradation as intersectional, material and sociopolitical, inviting us to consider not just the air, but the policies that contaminate our bodies. While Sierra presents us with a grid of dirt and grime, as I've described it, he leaves the interpretation fairly open. There are many other contemporary artists exploring the role of art in addressing the climate crisis and its impact on global health who go a step further, presenting their work in more overtly activist terms. For example, Tomás Saraceno, the Argentine artist whose work is right above our heads this evening, identifies as both an artist and environmentalist, advocating through his artistic projects for an Aerocene era, a term that he's created, in which interspecies cooperation and clean air are required. In a body of work from 2021, I'm showing you a slide here titled, "We Do Not All Breathe the Same Air," he contends directly with the inequities that shape access to clean air. Saraceno was inspired by the medical ethicist Harriet A. Washington to conduct research on the uneven distribution of pollutants based on geopolitical affiliation and race. The works consist of the works in this body that I'm showing you specifically, 7 large frame pieces containing strips of paper that measure the pollution at various locations in 7 states over 2 years. The degree of pollution here is visualized through these rows of dots, ranging from the nearly invisible to the very dark. The dots were made using a BAM machine. I won't pretend to know what that is, but Jay, you can tell us what it is, that measures particulate matter over time. The grids he constructs evoke sort of, some people see them as looking like faint or distant moons or different phases of the moon. But they illustrate in stark terms the imbalances where clean air is concerned in the United States. While Saraceno's project offers a more explicit socio-political commentary and a call for climate justice, both of his work and Sierra's spark interesting questions about how visual representations of environmental contamination function to encourage viewers' awareness of their position within a polluted world, as well as the limitations and the possible pitfalls that arise from such representations. Our panelists tonight each think deeply about how images function in environmental communication. We have asked them to offer short presentations that engage tensions at the core of this notion of a toxic sublime, namely the relationship between visualizing what is often invisible, abstract, and destabilizing, including the toxicity of a place or an object or a situation, and how such visualizations might catalyze attitudinal change for better or worse. Sheren will be our first speaker tonight. She is Associate Professor of Art History in the Department of Art History and Archaeology here at WashU, where she specializes in contemporary political art, borders, and ecology. Isla is the author of 2 books, Portable Borders, Performance Art and Politics on the U.S. Frontera since 1984, which she published in 2015, and Border Ecology, Art and Environmental Crisis at the Margins, which she just published last year. Recent work of hers has appeared in journals such as ASAP-J? Okay. Geohumanities, and the Journal of Borderland Studies, and in the edited volumes, Liquid Borders and Expanding the Parameters of Feminist Activism. In addition, Isla heads the collaborative mapping project Race and Community Art on the U.S.-Mexico border and is a faculty lead for WashU's Moving Stories initiative, cataloging and exhibiting narratives of migration in the St. Louis region and beyond. She is also an associate director for the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. Suzanne Loui is a lecturer in environmental studies and arts and sciences. Her courses reflect her passion for bridging the humanities with scientific inquiry around topics and challenges of climate change. She's often collaborated with colleagues in the fields of physics, ecology, biology, and engineering. Some of her recent courses include Introduction to Environmental Humanities, Environmental Modernism, which focuses on the role of technology in human and planetary health, and Fallout, which is a class I'd really like to take, examining the evolution in the public perception of nuclear technology. In 2018, she began an ongoing project called Science Communication and Humanities that she's titled Humans of Tyson, in collaboration with the Tyson Research Center. And last but certainly not least is Jay Turner as a professor of energy, environmental, and chemical engineering. He's the James McKelvey Professor of Engineering Education, Vice Dean for Education, and inaugural head of the Division of Engineering Education, all within the McKelvey School of Engineering. Jay is a chemical engineer by training and focuses on environmental engineering. Examples from his current research include identifying and quantifying sources of air pollution in Central Asian cities, a South Africa-based study to examine relationships between air pollution and Parkinson's disease, and a Louisville-based study of relationships between greenness, air pollution, and cardiovascular health. And as we'll hear tonight, Jay's team also works here in St. Louis. Each speaker will offer a 5-ish minute introduction to their work and interests related to climate change. I will then moderate a discussion with the panelists before opening up to questions from all of you in the audience tonight. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, including Washington University Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, and the Center for the Environment. This discussion is also part of Ecology Now, Art and Humanities in the Anthropocene, which is a series of public events that invite us to consider our rapidly changing environment through the lenses of visual art, religion, public health, and cultural studies. And I do believe, I meant to bring up here, I do believe at the visitor's desk there are brochures that show you there's still several more events happening this semester, so on your way out, please take one. There's a ton of really engaging programming. So, I'm done talking. I would like to invite Isla to come up to the podium to start the presentation.
All right, thank you, Meredith, and thank you all for being here. It's always fun to, I think, convene in this space and talk about art that we're actually seeing in person, which, again, we can't always take for granted. I am going to, and I can just move this, this is just advance, okay. Oh, that's the wrong way. There we go. So I'm going to offer you a very brief overview of this phrase toxic sublime. It's something that I have engaged with in my research and in my most recent book publication. We're really just going to be scratching the surface of it, so feel free to ask more during the Q&A session. I'm going to contrast the toxic sublime with the techno sublime, which is actually the concept that I think kind of birthed it, for lack of a better phrasing. So the sublime itself, the 18th century concept of the sublime, Kant, Burke, right? This idea of an overwhelming nature, right? Against which we as humans are rendered small and insignificant. That's the sort of classical definition of the sublime. In the mid-20th century, we have the concept of the techno-sublime, which comes into being with both the nuclear age and the space race. It's both kind of the amazing capacity, the awe-inspiring capacity of humanity's ability to traverse the bounds of Earth, but also humanity's awe-inspiring capacity to destroy itself. And so I give you an Isamu Noguchi proposal, which was never realized, but it's sculpture to be seen from Mars. And in the post-war period, right, Noguchi, Japanese-American, thinking about sort of this level of destruction of which humanity is recently rendered itself capable. And again, it was never realized this is a sand model. The length of the nose was to be a mile. So again, if we think of scale, awe-inspiring scale, but also a kind of monument to outlast humanity. Toxic sublime is about visualizing that which cannot be seen in sort of these sort of traditional timescales or through traditional forms of visibility. And there's a couple of theorists coming out of communication studies and rhetoric, not even art history specifically, who have worked on sort of defining this term and complicating it. So rhetorician Jennifer Peoples talks about the toxic sublime as the counterpart and required other to the technological sublime. It shares a marvel at human accomplishments, but instead, in contrast to the sublime in nature, the horror of the toxic sublime calls to question the personal, social, and environmental ethics that allows these places of contamination to exist. And she and several of her colleagues look at the work of several environmental photographers, such as David Maisel and Edward Bertinsky, to illustrate this concept of the toxic sublime. And I'm showing you, I have a couple of David Maisel images here. These are from his extremely long, ongoing series called The Lake Project, in which he photographed Lake Owens, which is in California. And until very recently, apparently as of this year, it's finally gotten water and it's no longer a completely dry and contaminated lake bed. But at the time of his project, and again, this is 2001 for this image, the lake had dried up. It was full of contaminants that were carcinogenic. And he's visualizing this sort of lurid hellscape. And he's doing so in a way that defamiliarizes the viewer. We don't see a horizon line. This is not a traditional landscape in which we can place and orient ourselves. Instead, we're viewing the lake from above, these aerial photographs, and he's up in an actual airplane. This is before drones, right? So he's up in an airplane taking photographs of this lake, zooming in on sections that, again, due to their coloration, due to their topography, they become eerie and otherworldly. And the photographs are beautiful. Here's another one. I just put two in there for you. The photographs are beautiful. They're technically proficient. And can you imagine putting these on your wall? There are plenty of folks who would, and there's no judgment in that. But it's actually, right, you're visualizing something horrifying. You're visualizing environmental destruction. You're visualizing contamination, as well as sort of the long-term effects of pollution. Again, thinking of carcinogens, thinking of cancer rates in the area. That which, even though we're seeing something that registers as both beautiful and horrifying to our eyes, we're not seeing the long-term effects of the pollutants in this lake. That is the invisible sort of slow violence, to use a term coined by Rob Nixon, that's occurring out of sight and on timescales beyond human capacity. Edward Bertinsky, and I apologize, I don't have a great image of this because he's very protective of his photographs, but Edward Bertinsky is another photographer who is often brought up in this discussion of the toxic sublime. In his Mines series, he photographs, again, he photographs mines from a variety of vantage points. And what I love about the Kennecott copper mine image, this is in Utah, and I have been to the Kennecott copper mine, and it really confounds you with its sense of scale. It's very hard to tell how large this mine is, even in this image. And so if we think about the sublime, it kind of triangulates the sublime. We have the kind of awe-inspiring scale of the 18th century sublime, as well as this sense of human achievement and ingenuity in creating a feature this huge. And again, this sense of toxicity, degradation of the landscape, and sort of the invisible cost of this mining on this scale. So I want us to think of the toxic sublime, again, maybe for the discussion and for our Q&A, thinking about the toxic sublime in terms of whether or not it has a political utility. Because we can look at these images, but how do we translate maybe the horror, that combination of beauty and horror that we witness, into action? And that's where a lot of the critics of this form of environmental art making diverge, right? There are some who say this is enough to inspire political action, to raise awareness, consciousness raising, and there are others on the other side who say this is not giving us information about what we're looking at. And we can say the same thing about Santiago Sierra's work, which is on our wall today. Oh yeah, I threw this one in there just for fun to think about, again, issues of the sublimity, and in this case, this sort of vengeful deity who rises from a trash heap. This is Fabrice Montero, who's working in Dakar in Senegal, and he's actually a fashion photographer, and so this is a combination of fashion photography, digital media, and these just really incredible garments that are made out of trash and recycled materials. But it also evokes this idea of a toxic sublime and a kind of vengeful deity rising from pollution. There's just a couple from this series, but they're really quite amazing. So again, just to think about the different ways that sublimity can be visualized in this way. Again, visualizing what cannot be seen. And then the last artwork I'll leave you with, because it relates directly to air pollution, is Michael Pinsky's Pollution Pods, which I have not experienced myself. And I am curious what you all think about, would you actually step into them? And I'd love to hear from our science colleagues about whether it's safe to do so or not. These are 5 interconnected geodesic domes, which contain air that emulates the relative presence of ozone, particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide, which are in sort of like Norway village air. So imagine like the purest Norwegian village air you can imagine. And then you go sequentially through London, New Delhi, Sao Paulo, and Beijing. And this is just another really interesting image of it when it was installed in London. And so again, in these cases, you're not visualizing the contaminant, but you are actually taking it into your body and stepping into this space, and it entails a kind of risk. Again, the extent of that risk, I'm not entirely sure. It also doesn't necessarily give us more information about what time of year in these cities, right? Or what are the weather conditions that would give rise to air pollution at that, of that specific content. So again, it's a very affective experience. It's one that is deeply embodied and permeates the boundaries of the body, but it also, again, raises many questions that are left unanswered. So on that note, I will cede the floor to my colleagues. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne. I'm from Environmental Studies. It's great to be here. Thanks for asking me, Meredith. So I'm a lecturer in the Environmental Studies program where I work in the field of environmental humanities. Let me see if you've got... Okay. I think I'm not getting this right. There. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. where I work in the field of environmental humanities. I track the human relationship with nature throughout time in different historical periods and different landscapes based on an analysis of many human features: gender, ethnicity, religious beliefs, nationality, and others. I find this most successful when I can bridge the humanities with scientific inquiry to better understand exactly what aspects of nature people are encountering in a given time and place, and to better understand how environmental harm to humans and harm to the environment by humans is being depicted. For example, as Meredith said, I work on the evolution and perception of energy technologies with a focus on nuclear energy. And I couldn't do this without generous colleagues like Lisa Bach, a professor of chemistry and physics, who can offer scientific insights on contaminants and landscapes, or for other work with those at the Tyson Research Center, sharing with me their conservation biology and ecology. I always say I have a lot of scientific friends who are very nice, and they let me ask very simple questions because I start at the basics. Artists play an especially important role in the depiction of harm to humans from environmental challenges, in this case, toxicity. And that's because they're uniquely good at representing how humans stand in relationship to a given toxic material. Sierra's exhibit, 52 Canvases Exposed to Mexico City Air, is a compelling, effective, and strategic method of identifying and exhibiting airborne contaminants, exposing those adhesive-covered panels to the floor. Like a wrinkle in time, the final product impresses on us the long-term process of being affected by atmospheric contamination, but does so in a short amount of time and in a small space relative to the atmosphere. Sierra succeeds by using the conceit of increased density of the toxin over time as reflected by color. And I want you just to keep that in mind because we'll come back to it again. His work provides an emotional experience which effectively moves us to feel the effects of it on our bodies and elevates the environmental and personal predicament. Human and non-human life are continually absorbing unclean air. This is happening to you, the viewer, right now, and who knows at what point you are situated along the axis of long-term exposure. As a singular exhibit, it's wonderful. And yet, harm to humans from the environment is not the only issue, nor the complete story. What if our representations of such harm themselves become toxic? One thing we think about in environmental studies is risk perception and human health during this era of climate change. Those in the field of risk perception draw on cognitive and neuropsychology. They have long known that the human brain is hardwired to feel first and think secondly. Reason carries only so much weight. Emotion and instinct easily overwhelm conscious and purposeful reasoning. My environmental studies colleague, teaching professor Eleanor Pardini, offers an entire course on this called Beyond the Evidence. So if people are exposed continually to artistic representations of contaminants as a threat to their health, without also having a context for scientific solutions or scientific understanding, they often begin to feel chronic stress and fear. And that leads people to make poor decisions. They may take more risks because they feel all is lost. And it can lead communities to make policies that respond to what they fear rather than responding to the actual level of threat or engaging in evolving positive solutions. So to what extent does the exhibit convey the risks of and solutions to the environmental contaminants, the breakdown of what enters our bodies and maybe what does not? And to what extent does the artist have the responsibility to even do so? We live in times of great disinformation and misinformation. Environmentalism in the United States has a long history of magnifying environmental harm to warn communities and states and governments about the disintegration of the environment and of hazards to their health. But that strategy alone has been inconsistently successful over history and is wearing us thin during this age of climate change. It is my feeling that we have to expose the general public to scientific understanding and solutions as much as environmental harms. We don't want to eliminate good work like Sierra's 52 canvases, but I'd like to send out a bit of a call to artists to build on it by finding ways to elevate scientific solutions as much as they do environmental harm. Let's compare artistic representations of this contamination to another. My choice of example may seem provocative, at least it's more politically fraught, but it shouldn't be since it affects public health far less than the contaminants in Sierra's exhibit do. All the radioactive waste of the Netherlands is stored by a company called Covra for at least 100 years in above-ground buildings designed for this purpose. The storage buildings are designed as works of art. Covra and art have been strongly interwoven since the beginning of the storage project. What they are doing is inviting you to understand that you are safe in this space in proximity to this waste, stored using the reliable technologies and science we know how to apply. The artist William Verstraeten uses a similar strategy of representing density of the toxin over time as reflected by color. He similarly places the viewer in seemingly close relationship to the contaminant, but also leaves the public educated about solutions. So right here, art installation and waste site, as the contaminant, which in this case is nuclear waste, decays, the building will be painted a lighter color. They don't hide anything. We know it's going to take a long time. So 2003, 2023, 2043, all the way up to 2103. This is in the Netherlands, and EC2 indicates how much mass is lost when energy is removed. So in other words, we see that what we're looking at is the artistic depiction of a contaminant that is decreasing in harm. So as opposed to Santiago Sierra, that's increasing and we're exposed to it, this is decreasing and we're isolated from it. Vogue 2. In 2017, the first Orange Bunker acquired a blue sister, Vogue 2, a new storage building for depleted uranium. The building is bright blue with a few orange stripes and 15-meter-long stainless steel pipes sticking out of the roof edges at 3 corners of the building. These pipes make Vogue 2 the biggest sundial of Europe. This, too, is a reference to the time factor, which ultimately renders radioactive waste harmless. So sister storage to Habag, and U-308 is depleted uranium. So there are also these small little science lessons going on in this depiction of contained waste. They're giving the public a chance to be next to it. They're giving them a chance to learn what is happening. They're giving them a little more information than simply just that this waste is here. Now, this is on a sort of a campus, I would call it, on a peninsula in the Netherlands. It's open 5 days a week from 9 to 5. You can come on the grounds, you can stroll around, and it's your choice. No one, of course, is making you come close. The blue storage building for low-level and intermediate-level radioactivity is protected and has a controlled climate. In fact, everything inside is perfect for an art depot or an art storage facility. For this reason, Covra has made the interior space that is unusable for the storage of waste available to Netherlands museums. For the coming 100 years, the storage building will also function as a museum depot with various objects of art displayed between the containers of radioactive waste. So here you see that dual use of space for art, and it offers the public the option to stand inside, still in safe proximity to the contaminant. The climate-controlled space of Vogue 2 is used for art storage. and they call that the art of preservation. Oops, sorry, wrong way. Yeah. And between the barrels with radioactive waste, there's also a display case with very special content, which is the radium preparation that Marie Curie took 100 years ago by train from Paris to the Netherlands to study the effect of temperature on radioactivity. I think I've got one more. Yep, and there's a group. You can go on tours of this. Obviously, it's up to you if you would like to join a tour, but you can go on inside and look at the art that they're preserving inside this storage container for a contaminant that we fear. This art teaches the public how to stand in relation to a contaminant. Sierra's 52 Canvases is a great exhibit depicting environmental toxins. I am made uncomfortable by the thought of that accumulated crud in my lungs, and I leave the exhibit hoping for a solution. I also think that based on Sierra's other work, he would want me to view it through the lens of who I am. I'm a white privileged woman, and I have asthma. I don't worry about my asthma. I have medications, I have doctors, I have hospitals. The only thing that I have to fear is forgetting to fill my asthma prescription, and then I think about asthma. Otherwise, I never do. I'm pretty sure that for his exhibit, especially for those in Mexico City, there are a lot of people seeing it who don't have that option that I do. To look at it as that toxic sublime or work of art, it's really interesting, but I don't have to worry about it too much. So I really value what he does. I also know that people form opinions about environmental issues partially based on their emotional connotation to the issue. Again, this exhibition successfully leaves most, I believe, emotionally unnerved and wanting change. But especially during this period of climate change, I hope to see more art reflect modern scientific solutions as well as toxic pollutants. Thanks.
So it's a pleasure to be with you this evening. And again, I'm Jay Turner from the Engineering School. I'll be taking a very different tack. I will not pretend to be able to reflect upon art. And what I'll do is just take a few minutes and take you through my personal journey of the visual and interacting with the environment. But I have to first comment about one of the slides that Meredith showed with those little circles representing air pollution. If only I had the creativity. I have cases and cases of exactly that type of circles sitting in my lab just across the green space. And to me, it's a matter of when do I throw it away? And never had I ever thought of doing something creative with it. So if anyone ever wants some of those circles, like I have plenty. Right. So as Meredith mentioned, I do focus on air pollution work. And I focus on measurements. And what that really means is that my group and myself, we go into the most polluted places at the most polluted times a year, and we do measurements. Right? So it's a very visual activity for us, to say the least. And I'll share with you some examples of that in a moment. We're focusing mostly on urban environments, and recently we've also expanded our work to include noise pollution. And this becomes very interesting when you're thinking about urban and environment. We think about air and water pollution. We think about noise pollution, and it's more complicated because some noise is bad and other noise is good, but they all create decibels of noise, right? How do we tease that apart and think about what's damaging and what's restorative? It's a really fun academic activity that could have impact if we can come up with ways to focus on the nature's noise. We work on control strategies with governments and other stakeholders like NGOs. And we also, over the last 15 years, have really focused on exposures in human health. And Meredith mentioned some examples like our work on air pollution and cardiovascular health, Parkinson's disease. Well, how I got into this business was actually a strong visual connection to what we're hearing about today. I was an undergrad at UCLA, and I was racing sailboats. And this was in the 1980s, and if you look to the east in LA, it was pretty mucky. There was a lot of air pollution. It's much better now. And we would go down to the harbor, which was right on the Pacific Ocean, Marina del Rey. And we'd be thinking, wow, the air is clean, the air is fresh, I'm right on the coast. Those poor people in central LA and farther east. Then we take our sailboats to go practice, and we go half a mile offshore, and look back at where we were. Look at Marina del Rey, look at Santa Monica, and it was shrouded in smog. And that idea that if you're standing in it, because of the way the physics works of depth perception and visual range, especially like in an indoor environment, you don't realize how polluted it could be. It's only when you're looking at more distant objects that it really has the impact, okay? And that, to me, as an engineer, right away, just triggered all kinds of things of the dichotomy of feeling safe and realizing I'm not. And that's what I've spent the last 30 years working on. So again, my work has a strong connection to the visual. And, good, very good. And this is one place where we routinely go. This is Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, the capital of Mongolia, and in the wintertime, it's one of the most polluted places on the earth. All right? Now, we're often confronted with stark visual images like this of air pollution. You see them of New Delhi, you see them of other locations. But here, it's great because in the sense that people can see it, great in quotes, right? But the key is, how do you still take action about it? And one of the most profound experiences I had in Ulaanbaatar was I was advising on a hackathon online during COVID. And there was a student who was an undergraduate in South Korea who was Mongolian. And the student said, I never knew winter times could be so clean until I left my city. I had no idea. I just thought the whole world was like this. To me, that's profound, that visual connection that student had, that he extrapolated to the whole world, frankly, that we were all living in this and we're not. There's a lot of disparities in what we're facing. So we're dealing with these types of situations, and those images that we see in the room next door, that truly does represent what's accumulating in our lungs. It's a very realistic, quantitative representation. Our bodies can clear some of it, but a lot of it stays. And if you're ever bored, go online and look at lung dissections, and you'll see exactly what I mean, right? Especially of people who smoke, because air pollution's the same. Now, I just want to take a moment and chat a little bit about climate and climate change as a context and how this also exacerbates air pollution. So another aspect of Mongolia that to us is fascinating and disturbing at the same time is we do a lot of work in the countryside also, in small secondary cities, they're called, just as polluted as the capital. But to get there, you drive through landscapes like this. And this is the increased desertification, the Gobi Desert expanding. And you talk to the nomads, and the nomads, uneducated, will say, yes, every dozen years we have to move farther north because our animals can't graze on this land. It's too dry, it's just scrabble. And you ask them, why is it? They go, of course, it's climate change. I love it, and I'm disheartened when I come back and think of the challenges we face in even building the case that this problem exists. Well, what really makes this type of a situation interesting and disturbing is what'll happen is in the summertime, because of extended droughts and dryness, this is really about all you get. You might get a few weeks of green, and that's it. The animals are grazing on stubble, and they become very weak. And then periodically in the wintertime, you get snowstorms like this that bury the yurts in snow. And it's simply impossible for the nomads to clear away the snow to find that scrabble, and their herds die. And this is well known. They're called zoods, these storms, and herds die at magnificent scales. Well, what do you do then? You take your yurt, you rent or hire someone to put it in the back of a pickup truck, and you move to the edge of a city and find the last occupied piece of land on the edge of the city, and you put down your yurt, and that's where you now live. You've now become an urban dweller because you've lost your livelihood, all right? And when you do that, you burn coal for 24 hours a day for 6 months out of the year because it's minus 10 to minus 30 degrees centigrade, so minus 35 or so Fahrenheit. And this leads to exacerbated urban air pollution. to the visual picture I showed you a few slides earlier. Climate migration, all right? Very visual examples of climate migration that's occurring. Briefly, another example, Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, one of the most beautiful countries on earth, one of the most mountainous countries on earth in the summertime. And this is the wintertime, okay? And here, there's also a climate impact that we can pin down to this visual effect, a climate impact. But it's not the desertification and climate migration. Here, they rely a lot on hydroelectric because of the mountains, because of dams. And the hydroelectric, the dams aren't getting as recharged every year because of droughts. And that means that in the city, there's rolling blackouts in the wintertime because there's just not enough water to generate the electricity. And people change over to burning coal in their homes because of energy security. I can buy coal. I can't rely on the electricity to be on. So this is people across all income levels, not just the most economically disadvantaged, right? So again, my lived experiences of climate and the visual impact that it has day in and day out of the work that we do. So just to come into the finish line, this is not what St. Louis typically looks like anymore, and we're really fortunate. St. Louis's air quality has improved dramatically over the last 100 years. The iconic photo at the top right, originally published in the Post-Dispatch, of the streetlights being on at midday. That is not a nighttime photo, right? That's a midday photo of how bad it really was, as bad as London, by some measures at least. Even much later, the 60s, late 60s or so, you would have the arch grounds where you could see the top but not the bottom because we're shrouded in smog. People know it's polluted. Did they appreciate the extent of the health effects? Probably not. But it's visual, right? It rarely looks like that. But periodically we get a reminder. And we've had some of those reminders lately, and we're going to see them more often. The lower right was just 3 years ago when there were wildfires in the western U.S. that created what might have looked pretty as this yellow haze, but this was very polluted and very bad for us. And then more importantly, last year, the Canadian wildfires that came down from northeastern Canada for weeks caused air pollution here in St. Louis. It's a very visual reminder of all this. Now in closing and coming back to this point about there's toxins in the things we can't see, and I'm focusing here on the things we can see. There is toxins in the things we can't see, including in the air here in St. Louis. And we are breathing different air quality here in St. Louis. And one of the challenges is that it's not visual. If we go to different neighborhoods, the air pollution is different. And there is a strong environmental racism context to it. And we're working hard on that right now. So for example, we've been working with Metropolitan Congregations United to engage with churches, with congregations, putting air monitors outside of churches in areas that have high environmental justice index rankings, concerns about EJ-related issues. And we're working with the churches and meeting with the congregations. And when I say we, I mean my graduate students. They're awesome. They're out there meeting with the congregations, sharing the data of what we learn about how does air pollution vary across the city in your neighborhood compared to everywhere else. We're working in Dutchtown, where there's concerns about asthma, measuring air pollution literally every few blocks, measuring the air pollution for an entire year and finding variations that happen literally within block by block, whereas we used to all think, oh, a neighborhood's all the same. This is the type of activities that it's great to see WashU engaging with in terms of engaging with our community. And none of this air pollution is visual, and it all has adverse health effects. So I look forward to the discussion and hearing where this all goes, because you have the profound visual effects, but in the toxic sublime, you also have the things you just don't see.
No, that one's not on. Yeah, just hold it down.
Is it on? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Here, I'll move over here so you have a little more space.
Put a pretty slide up or something. Put a pretty slide up or something.
Oh, okay. I think we have, go back to this.
Thank
but-
you.
All right, Well, first, I want to thank you three for engaging with me on putting together this panel. Your presentations were super interesting. I have such a range of questions to ask you. I really appreciate all your expertise in your different disciplines. And so, as I mentioned, I'm just going to kick off with a couple questions, and then we'll check the time, open it up to, I'm sure you all have questions as well. The first thing I want to come back to is, you know, Suzanne, you had a really nice discussion of, you know, your reactions to the Sierra and bringing up this question of affect. You know, that you had, you know, this, for you at least, it evoked this sort of emotional response too, and you talked a lot about how this idea of risk perception too is tied into that kind of very emotional response. And I'm wondering, Isla, you kind of touched a little bit on this too, you know, about the difference between these kind of photographic representations that you mentioned in relationship to the toxic sublime and the more kind of affective kind of works of art, like these bubbles, you know. So I wonder if we could draw that out a little bit more, you know. What do you think about that kind of affective turn? Are works doing something different? Is it more effective maybe in a sense of like awareness or possible change? And Jay, I also want to know what you think about these bubbles, about what going into them. Does anybody want to take? Go ahead.
I mean, I can start talking about bubbles all day long, but I do want to know, I mean, because again, I haven't experienced that myself, but there is something I think fundamentally different, right, about seeing something, you know, mediated through the photographic lens and all the choices that the photographers are making in those cases, or again, the stylistic choices that Sierra is making, right? We're protected from the pollutants on those canvases where they're not coming into our lungs. They're sealed. And I like that the description talks about how they're sealed, right? And so that, right, that idea of being sort of hermetically sealed off from us versus something that is crossing boundaries into our space. It's not limited to environmental art. I mean, I could go on and on about art that sort of crosses boundaries and permeates the senses, especially olfactory art, just even thinking about the sense of smell and how that really kind of registers on a very different level. I do see it as, I mean, I wouldn't say it's necessarily like an affective turn, but I do think that idea of experience fits in with our larger turn toward experiential art. We have a lot more art installations that invite participation and engagement and embodiment even today than back in the early 2000s and the 80s when Bertinsky and Maisel and this sort of turn toward the toxic sublime in photography was going on. So this sense of like art as experience, you know, you're going to a biennial or you're going to an exhibition, you're going to get in that geodesic dome and potentially, you know, breathe the air. But you also have then the privilege, and I like that you brought up privilege, Suzanne, because you have the privilege of stepping out again. And hopefully your lungs can kind of clear that out. But yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to go there and talk about the geodesic dome. I think it's incredible, actually. The representation of it, I'm looking forward to learning more about, because you could see how different the polluted domes were, and I'm very curious about, even though if it was meant to represent different cities, how good of a job it does with that. The question I have, actually more for the audience when we get to that time, is I work on this, I see this, you can see the environments I work in. When you see an exhibit like this, how do you internalize it? And I think that's part of this question, is the affect. And how do you, because for me, it's, yes, this is what I see it every day in my lab on a filter, just like those tapes. But how if you're not working in this space? And if you were a citizen and presented with this, how do you internalize that this is actually a threat that's physically attacking me, even if I don't see it out there today? That's the thing I'm really curious about, is that internalization, or is it too abstract?
Right.
Yeah, I'm really wondering about this idea of, you know, risk perception, and do people walk away feeling like they're hit with these representations of harm more often than not? Is it something that you feel saturated with, or is it something that you feel like, bring it on, we should do it even more? We think about this a lot in environmental studies, like what's the right balance, so that we can both educate with solutions, and also we never want to turn our backs on harm that's being done. But how do you put them together in the right balance?
So I think my next question was really about, for Jay and for Suzanne, about the way you talked about, is it COVRA? Yeah. Right. As a kind of, for me, it seemed like this is about like anxiety management, maybe. What was happening there? And I'm also wondering, because I think it was an interesting relationship to put the nuclear waste in these concrete, like, I'm assuming that's what those concrete containers were too, with this kind of like pairing it with this idea of cultural heritage, right? Like the museums can like then actually display their work and like playing with these ideas of preservation. And that ultimately for me, like, is it the nuclear waste becoming part of that like idea of cultural heritage? I mean, this is something you're left with. Everybody has to deal with it and think about it and how it's preserved and how it's managed. I mean, those are some of the questions that came up. And I guess I was trying to make a leap. I'll let you answer first. But Jay, I do want to talk to you about like your work and how you convey the kind of studies that you're doing to people. This one is about maybe about managing anxieties. Jay, how are you communicating the kind of findings that you're having to the kind of the neighborhoods you're working in as well?
Yeah, I don't think it's about managing anxiety. I think it's about educating people about what we know how to do. You know, there's a certain sophistication about this that says we know how to contain these wastes. We have them. Maybe we don't want them, but they are here. And we know how to do it well, and we know how to do this so it doesn't harm people. And so they do it in a manner that they hope is educating you about the safety of this particular containment. So for me, it's not so much about trying to calm people down, is bringing them into a better understanding of what we know how to do. And it's, you know, I don't think we're ready for it in the United States, quite frankly. I think we have a very different feeling about this kind of waste and waste storage, which I think is a shame because the technical ability is there. And oftentimes it's just hidden because people don't want to engage with it. And that's okay. Everybody should be where they are with it. But I think it's really interesting that in this other country, they're at a very different level with the way they understand it and with the comfort levels, obviously, that they're willing to engage with.
No, for us, that communication's a huge challenge. And what we've learned over time is to be incredibly humble and really work with people who have the deep expertise in the local context. So for example, when we're working in Mongolia, we hire local NGOs to help us with the outreach component and the education component. Or in Kyrgyzstan, we advocate for educating the healthcare professionals because they're frontline working with people. There are times where we engage ourselves, but we really realize that the messenger is as important as the message in many ways with these types of topics. We're always challenged with situations such as in Kyrgyzstan when you're trying to convey the air pollution damage on health and you're told, my grandmother lived to be 87, she was a chain smoker, this can't be bad for me, right? That's the classic scenario. And you say, yes, but for every grandmother living to 87 chain smoking, there's a lot of infants that died prematurely, right? But so it's hard for people to make connections outside of their own lived experience, and that's understandable. So you have to figure out how to get into their lived experience. And also to find who the most trusted individuals in the community are. And that's why in Mongolia, we work with kindergarten teachers because they are among the most trusted people in the community.
Well, let me just ask one more question, so I'm aware of the time, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And maybe I just wanted to come back to the question you actually asked, Isla. Maybe if you all have thoughts about, this notion of a toxic sublime that we've been talking about, if it does have some kind of, do you think it has some kind of political utility, possibly? Or is it really just this I think I go back and forth myself between thinking, is awareness, is it a raising awareness, or is it, really anxiety producing in the end?
Well, it's a question that I think we could spend hours discussing. But I do think there is a utility for the toxic sublime in terms of a visual representation if it allows one to ask more questions and find out more information. If there's a didactic component as well as maybe an ambiguous visual component. And like with David Maisel's photographs, I mean, there is an entire book project about the lake, and he does kind of link you to more information about it. But it's not always, and someone like Edward Bertinsky is purposely, he keeps his politics, I think, a little less clear, in terms of his photographs. So he's not claiming to be a politically engaged artist. He's just giving you large format photographs of of human devastation. So it really, I mean, I think if it allows you to ask questions, and that is one of the things I like about this piece. I've brought a lot of people to see it, and they've had so many questions, and it didn't answer their questions. We don't expect artists to like be, to do all of the work, right? But the fact that it raised those questions and it caused us to discuss and spend more time thinking about the air quality around us, I think in that sense that there was, I think, a level of success there.
Well, why don't we open it up to the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
I started coming into St. Louis in the 1960s and 1970s, flying into St. Louis. And the bubbles currently, I'm putting myself back then and could imagine, could I see this piece of art back then, I would be flying into a bubble. Nevertheless, in the next 10 years, we had the Clean Air Act. When was that, 63 or 73?
Big one was 1970.
70.
The one with teeth.
Thank you, right there, during that time. What was different about the political climate, about the artistic climate, awareness, and fear? I can only recall a couple of big names that are associated with environmentalism. Rachel Carson back then, and Edward Albee, Desert Solitude. But, okay, the question is, what was different in various aspects of our culture back then than now?
One big thing is that people had more economic resources. They had more free time. We had come out of World War II into the 50s and into the 60s, and more people were just brought into a space where they could look at pollution. It wasn't that pollution didn't exist before. If it did, why didn't environmentalism exist before? If it was just pollution, seeing pollution, and that's not what it was. I tend to think it was that economic security and the education and the free time to actually have the ability to say to myself, I'm going to focus on making this environment better. We suddenly had reached a plateau where you could do that. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I'll leave that one. I don't know.
I'll also add, I think, I wasn't alive at that time, but I do think there was potentially less misinformation than there is today. Maybe there, but I do feel like in terms of climate, right, there are people who seem to believe radically different things than even what their eyes are telling them. Maybe that's a diplomatic way of putting it. So the fact that these sorts of things have become, or they're even more, they were always politicized, but the way that they've been politicized recently, I think, seems to be driving a wedge. Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know, but from my understanding, and it's in relation to the Sublime, which would also lead to a little bit of a different understanding of the Santiago Sierra. So from my understanding, it is the American discourse around work, where it's really about beauty and fear. But with Kant, starting with Kant, there's always this element that we as human beings, through our enlightened understanding of the world, control actually that fear. And so there's this moment of hope. And that continues from Kant to Adorno, basically. And I know that in the 60s, 70s, there was this argue basically that the sealant is in the Sierra is basically what turns it into the Sublime, showing the control over the pollution and showing the control over these dangerous elements. So I have recently not really worked on the Sublime, but I did in the past pretty much so. And so I just wanted to bring these two different discourses, the American work in the 18th century, and then starting actually with Enlightenment and Kant, that changed. So there was this cathartic moment added to the Sublime. And I don't know which way we are still part of Enlightenment or not, but we are. Probably, but so it is this moment where we as human beings actually still think we can, since we are thinkers, since we are humans, we can actually control the environment or control this moment of fear, in which way that always plays out in different articles or something like that. Anyway, more a question for Isla probably. Anyone else?
I mean, yeah, it's fine. I'm teaching this tomorrow. I should be more prepared. No, I do think what happens. I mean, the sort of shift. I do take your point about sort of Burke and Kant are not that they're not coterminous, right? In the sort of the development of the Sublime. And I do think in terms of kind of romanticism, like 19th century landscape, I do feel like it was, depending on what you looked at, there was this sense of being just incapacitated by the overwhelming beauty of nature, but then also that the sort of positioning of the human within that gave a kind of signal, right, of human relationship and control, or, even just kind of, the human not completely overwhelmed by the Sublime, but sort of in the face of it. I'm thinking of like The Monk by the Sea, for example, right? The Caspar David Friedrich painting. But in terms of the toxic Sublime, because it's sort of warped through the mid-20th century kind of techno-sublime, where it's positioning everything on the human and how human forces have generated something beyond their control. So I think there's a different relationship to control and human agency than even in sort of these earlier conceptions of it. I know I'm just theorizing on the spot here, but I think that's a way of sort of differentiating, right, the role of the human. I think that's a really intriguing point about the sealant being, right, this, and it's what renders it an artwork and puts it on, like, renders it something that can be preserved, and also that it no longer changes. So the idea of capturing that pollution, which was sort of all around us, but it almost, right, it tames it, it renders it something that can be contemplated. I do see that as sort of falling in line there.
Well, then we could put some of these artworks into these two baskets. So the Maisel and Vertinsky photographs are Burkean Sublime objects. What's it called? The storage facility?
Oh, Cobra.
Cobra is a Kantian example of control, visually showing anybody who wants to come in, yes, we can control this. Does that map at all for you experts?
To the extent that control is contained, I don't think, again, that there is that baseline of feeling like there's going to be so much pushback. I think different cultures think differently about the very contaminant that is being contained. So that's
the evidence in the United States is the resistance to the super storage facility in Utah.
That's right, and you saw the slide. Yeah, sure.
But maybe control is also the wrong word. I think what Isla said, agency is much better term.
I think that's a great term.
I think that's very important.
I just have a question. And having lived through the same eras and flying into LA when I was 16 and seeing that heavy layer of complex, and one that kind of took your breath away, and then all the different acts that we all go through every day, speaking to your anxiety, which I think we do live with anxiety about pollution. I think I would have been more encouraged if his composition had been reversed, if it had started out dark and ended up light. It's kind of discouraging. So my question is, it's great to see it illustrated, but do you feel as professionals encouraged with our air as it is going forward with all the programs that have been put in place, or do you just feel it's really stagnant? And I also want to say, the 2 times I've been to Beijing, it was dark black with gold, and then almost reverse the second time.
Yeah, well, there's even been a paper that came out recently from a colleague here at WashU that at least for this particle type of air pollution, globally we might have gone through the maximum. We might have passed the worst point if you did a global look at things, and things are on that right trajectory because of places like China cleaning up so much. It's sort of a tug of war in that there's no doubt places, at least like in the US, are getting so much better. But at the same time, our dear colleagues down at the medical school and such keep sharpening their tools, their research tools, and they can find adverse health effects at lower and lower levels. And this is actually a challenge that brings me back to some of this visible, not visible part is as we learn more about the health effects of air pollution at lower and lower and lower levels, simply because we didn't have the tools in the past, we're getting more into that regime where you'll be affected by things even more so that you can't see. So I see it even more of a challenge going forward of convincing people there's still something to be concerned about, frankly.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your story about being on the boats off the coast and finally being able to see sort of from a distance all the pollution. And I was thinking about this idea of distance and how it sort of connects to the mindful photographs that I was showed as well, where they're being taken from a plane so far away from the actual that of the lake. And how distance can be great for those ideas of visualization, but do you think both in your scientific research and elsewhere within art that becomes a sort of barrier to your audience's connection to that work because it's so taken from a distance?
I mean, yeah, distance. I actually wrote that down. Actually, the bit about distance, because I was there are a few wonderful things that you both said. But yeah. So only when we look at a distance, right, do we notice, or can we actually see? And so that sense of scale, of stepping back. I mean, we got that with the mine photograph as well. Like you can't understand the mine unless you're sufficiently far away. But then you don't have any sense of what the scale is. And I think that is. I think it's a really fascinating factor when we come to all of this. I mean, imagine if the Sierra had been, double the number, maybe, or what if he'd done one for every single day? And then we'd have to imagine how far back you'd have to step to take it all in and look at it. So even kind of just like the choices that are made in works like this to kind of cap it at a certain scale, to kind of force the eye into, or force the viewer into a kind of physical relationship with it. I think that's really, I think there are pluses and minuses, right? There's no, I think, one ideal vantage point from which to really comprehend.
I suppose it's a very personal perspective, but I am certainly a person where physical distance would definitely give me a disconnection in a big way to an issue like this. Right? There's no doubt about it. I know some people are very moved by seeing the images from space looking back at Earth. Just me personally, I'm too disconnected when I look at something like that. So I think everyone reacts differently, but I very much share that point, that sort of the zoomed out lens, which shows the scope of the magnitude of the problem, at least for me, is also disconnecting, and that's a challenge.
I think we can take one last
Question, yeah.
I was just thinking in connection to that, I'm wondering how effective you think visual is in general in terms of in art or in scientific communication about communicating these things. I was thinking about like experiences I've had of being in highly polluted places and the physical feelings of sore throat and like those effects. So I'm curious, like in terms of art that you see that's using other modes besides the visible to communicate about this, or ways that this is happening in scientific communication as well.
So, one of the things I walked away with, again, I'm going to read a lot more about, is the domes, right? Because it's possible in those domes, it's a whole body experience. It could be, hopefully not the extreme of the sore throat, maybe the eyes, I don't know. But I agree, there's that physical effect that's very real when you're in those environments. I would love to know how much insurance they needed to do that in case someone actually got sick in that environment. But yes, I do feel that anything, for me personally, again, I'm only speaking personally, anything that the art can do that actually affects more senses than my visual senses, for me personally, is much more profound, much more profound.
No, I'm really curious too about all of the details of that specific work. Yeah, because I mean, you can always step out. You can choose to go through you can hang out in Norway if you want and never go further. But I'm curious to, how much time do you have to spend at a given concentration for there to be any kind of harmful effect? And having traveled to cities that are among the world's most polluted during the most polluted times, like I know what that feels like, and it is this sort of whole body malaise even before you even notice the actual symptoms. And so, yes, that's that idea of it acting on a kind of on this cellular level. Vision is sort of the primal, or the kind of the primary sense of mass communication, particularly online. And so we're sort of balancing what can be easily comprehended by a kind of mass audience versus a very kind of bespoke experience of getting to go into a dome or a chamber and have a full body sensory experience. So I think questions of access also have to be balanced in relation to these questions. Like, I really want to go now to the Netherlands and go to, I am figuring out how to get there, because that sounds amazing. Also, do they not have NIMBYism there? Like, I have so many questions. But.
All right, I said the last one, but Angela, you can have the last question. Okay.
Question for Suzanne about picking up on Meredith's point about the extent to which these works are really managing stress, managing anxiety. And I tend to believe that that's what they are. There's a certain amount of advertising going on, national branding, that we can contain this global problem. Because we're now a magician, we have better control of what we're doing. But that's another point. I mean, I think what I wanted to ask about is what seems to be lacking from, or absent, and these were great talks, I think there's a lot to think about, but I wonder about the issue of political will. I mean, of course we have the technical means to do all kinds of things to benefit, to reverse the horrendous challenges that we're facing environmentally. To me, the most pressing, urgent absence there is political will. So where does that figure into your rather optimistic and I think importantly, sort of shifting the balance away from anxiety presumably towards agency, but at what point does agency become sugar coating?
Yeah, and I think that we're a long ways away from it becoming too much. I think that we've gotten pretty hooked in the environmental world on emphasizing what is not going well, how the world is being destroyed, how we as human beings are destroying the environment, how it's a lot of negative. So I think that we can use a little bit of saying, oh, and by the way, there is a way that we could do this. I think that it comes from education, which is why I like that particular COVRA, art and science mix, because you're giving this to people in a way that is, it's a light touch. It is not putting this encapsulation of a contaminant far, far out of public view. It's education, and it's making it more of the norm than something that is just not to be tolerated. And I think that if we take more steps in that direction, it could at least help.
It still puts the responsibility on the shoulders of individual citizens.
Not really. I mean, in terms of coming to terms with it, you mean? I mean,
It's important. I don't disagree with that at all. I just said,
yeah.
you know, Jenny Rice's argument about this, that the environmental movement, by shifting responsibility to individual citizens, is taking the burden of transformational change away from where it really lies, which is with corporate.
And I don't think that this is at all an issue about individuals changing. I think it is an issue of governments being more forthcoming about the fact that we can do this. I don't want to get into the nuclear talk because I think that it's not really the point. But nuclear technology has been done in private. It's been done behind the scenes because it wasn't supposed to be talked about. This was this evil thing. And so it's all been done very, very quietly, the things that we've learned how to do. And now I feel like we're so intolerant to any of it that we can't understand that we know how to handle a lot of this pretty well. And that doesn't mean it's fine and we don't have to worry about it, but we have it and we're not so bad at handling it. And I think that a little bit of optimism in that realm, it could go a long way. And that means not just people being happier about it, but it means actually using our technologies in a way that help the public engage in a way that's more, I want to say more insightful. Let's put it that way.
Great. Well, I want to wrap things up and thank you all again for a really engaging talk. It's been a pleasure. If you haven't seen the work, please do take a minute. It's right around the corner. Go get up close, see some of that muck on the wall. Thank you for coming, and please also do pick up one of the brochures for the continued series as it goes throughout the rest of the semester. Thank you for coming.